Remember the Forgotten.
Chapter 12. Nowhere Bound. Sapphire sat still on an old log of wood. Its bark was dry, covered in years-old spider webs and crawling with insects on the underside where it met the grubby and long undisturbed soil. Two more of these logs sat parallel to it in a vague triangle, underneath the rays of the bright sun which shone gently down through the canopy of trees above it all. In the middle was a campfire, or at least what was left of one. It was cold and black, little more than a pile of charred debris and flaky ash too heavy to flow with the wind. Surveying the quiet forest scene from the sidelines, it was hard for Samuel to imagine that the pit had ever held any warmth. "What was this place?" he asked Sapphire, looking down at her seated figure. "This is where we used to meet up," she replied, not looking up from the ground. Her elbows rested on her knees, her chin in her hands, and her spirit elsewhere. "If James somehow hasn't got himself killed, this is where he'll come." "Does he do stuff like this often?" Samuel asked further, oblivious to Sapphire's annoyance. She remained silent for a few moments, before tilting her head slightly and staring outwards into the brightly lit forest. "He didn't used to," she finally answered. "Not before." Samuel listened blankly as she trailed off. It felt as if she expected him to press her, but he wasn't feeling quite so bold. She eventually sighed, straightened her posture, and continued. "Not before we lost Paz." Samuel swallowed visibly, doing a bad job of keeping his facial expression neutral. "And, he stuttered out, when did that happen?" "Not sure exactly," Sapphire responded, her eyes glazing over slightly. "It feels like so long ago now." A gentle breeze inched through the clearing, rustling the leaves in the trees. "Do you think he'll make it?" asked Samuel, breaking the moment of uncomfortable silence and trying to disguise the urgency in his voice. "James, I mean." "He always does," replied Sapphire, allowing herself a slight smile that didn't reach the eyes. It faded quickly. "It's hard for me to remember what he was like before that. Before we lost Paz, he wasn't so restless, so irresponsible, so careless. He wouldn't have done something like this. Not by himself, anyhow. And he certainly wouldn't have left Paz or me behind. Sometimes it feels like..." Silence hung in the air for a moment. Sapphire looked at the floor with a huff. You can tell me," Samuel then said. "I might understand." Sapphire looked at him with a questioning expression. His eyes now seemed softer, albeit still anxious. The green of his irises seemed dull amongst the trees and leaves, but something in them was still sharp. "It feels like," Sapphire finally continued, tired enough to not care. "It feels like at some point he started running, and just never stopped." A rustle in the branches grabbed both their attention, the sound of heavy breathing approaching them from the brush. James slowed to a stop as he pushed aside the lush branches and stumbled into the clearing, injured arm wrapped in a blood-stained makeshift bandage. Sapphire immediately began to walk towards him, quickly, breathing heavily and leaning against a tree in exhaustion. James looked at her with a sideways smile. "Did you miss me?" Sapphire punched him in the face. James fell backwards onto the cold ground, clutching his bleeding nose. Sapphire, face aflame with rage, scowled at him for a few moments before she turned around and stormed back towards the fire where their packs lay, ignoring his whines of pain. James then pushed himself to his feet with a sigh, pinching his nose and groaning before his eyes eventually settled on the sight of Samuel. His face dropped, and he turned to Sapphire with a look of indignant shock. "Why is he here?" Sapphire picked up her pack and thrust it over her shoulder, turning around to face James without a word. Her expression remained cold. "I came for the gem," Samuel answered for her, stepping in front of James in an unprecedented display of defiance. "I need it back." James looked down at him incredulously. "You knew those creatures were after the gem. You led them right to us." I told you not to go back to Machiavel, exclaimed Samuel. How was I to know there would be so many of them? So you admit it then, Sapphire called from the other side of the clearing. I, he stuttered in response, looking down at the floor. James shook his head, scowling at the boy as he withdrew the glistening gem from his pocket. Samuel went to grab at it, but like before, James simply held it out of reach. What could be so important that you'd sacrifice an entire village for it? He asked rhetorically, beginning to move towards Sapphire. Samuel raised his voice, though he sounded more upset than angry. That's not what happened. You tried to run away, howled James. You were ready to leave the village to those things. I had no choice, said Samuel. There are worse things at stake here. Sapphire's stoic face watched Samuel carefully as he spoke. What could be worse than those creatures? She asked him, her tone smooth and inquisitive. Samuel turned his head, flickering his gaze between James, Sapphire, and the gem. Finally, he sighed and rested his gaze upon the ground. The person controlling them. James and Sapphire met eyes. The person? Sapphire asked Samuel. What, some kind of sorcerer? Samuel nodded, his face firm. That's right. And if she's allowed to get that gem, the world as we know it will be over. And you plan to just outrun her and those creatures forever? James chuckled. You couldn't even escape us. There's more to it than that, growled Samuel, defensively. I can stop her, but I can't do it if you don't give me the eye. James and Sapphire exchanged looks. The eye? Asked Sapphire. The eye, the gem, call it whatever you like, answered Samuel. But if you don't give it back to me, we're all screwed. So you're saying, clarified Sapphire, if you lose this eye, the world will end. Yes, Samuel nodded. And if you can't stop this sorceress, the world also ends? Added James. Yes, exclaimed Samuel, growing impatient. All right, fine. James finally settled. Samuel breathed a sigh of relief, stepping forward to receive the gem. Thank you. We'll come along, continued James, but we aren't handing it over. Samuel's face contorted in surprise and outrage. You can't do that. The eye is mine. Not anymore, it isn't, stated James. We'll come with you and make sure you can do whatever it is you need to do, but the eye stays with me. Samuel looked to Sapphire in disbelief. She returned his look blankly. He then took a deep breath in, balling his fists and furrowing his brows, before finally looking back at James through strained eyes. Fine, he muttered. Have it your way. What, by the way, James immediately began, tossing the gem into the air and catching it repeatedly, is so special about this? As he caught the eye for the third time, he began to raise it to the light to get a better look. No! Shouted Samuel, lunging forward to grab the eye once more. James instinctively raised it into the air, scowling. You can't look into it, the boy told him. That's the one thing none of us can do. Sapphire aimed her gaze vaguely in its direction. Easier said than done. It's quite eye-catching. Samuel took another deep breath and looked up towards the gem, carefully avoiding its centre. You should keep it in some sort of bag. James sighed exhaustedly, retrieving a coin pouch from his belt and quickly emptying the contents into a pocket before carefully placing the gem inside the newly empty container. It fit perfectly. Raising it to eye level, he twirled it by the string as he examined the shape of the object within. Will that do? Sapphire asked Samuel. I suppose, he muttered in reply, pulling his satchel higher across his shoulder. We'd better get going. She won't give up until she finds us. Sapphire nodded and threw a bag towards James, who half-heartedly caught it at his chest. So be it. That night, Samuel lay asleep on his bedroll, his face squashed against the soft canvas as his chest slowly rose and fell with quiet breaths. The pale moonlight flooded down through the intermittent trees, providing little light through the gloomy night. No fire had been lit, and the stillness of the scene made James feel as if he were in a tomb. His eyes open as ever, he stared at the boy from across their small campsite, still unsure what to think. The book attached to his arm still lay by his side, the light gently reflecting off its thick cover. Feeling restless, James slowly climbed to his feet and nudged Sapphire with his elbow. "Huh?" she muttered, half asleep. James elbowed her again, harder. She startled up, instinctively reaching for her sword. When she looked up to see only James, she groaned and dropped back down to rest on her elbows warily. "What?" she asked, dryly, not really wanting an answer. "He's asleep," James replied. "And?" "Let's have a look in that book of his." Sapphire rolled over, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Unless you've learned how to read behind my back, I don't see what use that'll be." "There might be pictures or something," James argued. "Come on." Sapphire watched as James crouched down low and quietly began to creep towards where Samuel slept. She sighed to herself and soon began to follow. They crept unheard and unseen underneath the vibrant shadows until they both came to stand right beside the slumbering boy. Kneeling down carefully, James slowly lifted the resting book into the air and opened it up. The pages were filled with letters and words, none of which he could understand. Sapphire peeked over his shoulder. "Told you," she said. James ignored her, shaking his head and flipping to another page. He then grinned widely as two large drawings now filled up the dual pages. The one on the left depicted a man with long black hair, a floppy hood curled around his neck. The other, a woman, with lighter coloured hair and a curious expression. "Told you," James imitated smugly. "Whatever," spat Sapphire. "Just keep going." James flipped backwards, page by page, until two more faces eventually presented themselves. It took him a moment to realise what they were. One had messy hair, restrained behind a headband. The other tied up hair, and an expression far too familiar. It's us!" James exclaimed in a shouted whisper. Sapphire remained silent. "Why would we be in his book?" continued James. "I knew he was suspicious." "Maybe he drew them after our first meeting," Sapphire suggested, looking at James doubtfully, "so that he could find us the next day. Doesn't prove anything." James huffed and then turned the page again. His eyes shot open wide. There was another drawing, of a man they recognised. He swallowed hard. A million thoughts raced through his head, but none of them were focused enough to be spoken. Suddenly, a grunt came from Samuel as he shifted in his bedroll. James jumped up and quickly closed the book, laying it down on the ground as calmly as he would allow himself, before stepping backwards towards his bedroll. Sapphire remained for a few moments, and then followed. "Why?" James began as he restlessly sat himself back on his bedroll. "Why is Pasley in that book?" "Are you absolutely certain that we haven't met him before?" asked Sapphire, urgency leaking through the calmness of her voice. "No," admitted James. "But even if we had, why wouldn't he have mentioned it?" Sapphire's vacant stare settled on the ground. I don't know."
"You don't think," began James, looking over to where Samuel slept. "You don't think he had anything to do with what happened to Paz, do you?" James didn't turn around to look at Sapphire during the ensuing moments of silence. He knew there was no point when he heard her wordlessly lower herself onto her bedroll. James stayed sitting, his tired eyes fixated on the book lying across the way.